Greetings and salutations. Today we'll be covering the sad case of Lee Hyung-ho. At 5:30 in the evening on January 29th, 1991, 9-year-old Lee Hyung-ho, a native of South Korea, had been seen playing on a park swing set. The third grader had often played at that very same park with his friends after school, and he would often spend his time there until very late into the afternoon. However, on that day, things would be rather different. Lee had been seen playing by himself. Little would anybody know that would be one of the last sightings of young Lee Hyung-ho while he was alive. Hyung-ho lived in a high-end apartment community in Gangnam District, Seoul, South Korea, with his father, Lee Woo-shi. Woo-shi was an executive at a rather large company, which allowed his boy himself and the boy's stepmother to live rather affluent lives. Around 8 o'clock at night, Lee Woo-shi had realized that his son had as of yet not returned from school. This caused a wave of anxiety to pass through him, and after unsuccessfully making a round of phone calls to his son's classmates asking about his son, then being met with no answers that would lead him to his son, he and the boy's stepmother went out to look for him, checking all their son's usual hangout spots. However, regardless of how thoroughly they searched, the boy was nowhere to be found. After the phone calls and their initial search, Woo-shi and his wife made the decision to call the police and report the young boy as being missing. The police quickly dispatched an officer to speak with the Lee household. Said officer would go on to take a statement from the couple. However, while the officer was there was an unexpected and rather shocking development. As the officer was there, the family's phone began to ring. When Woo-shi picked up the phone, a vile voice began to speak from the other end of the phone. The voice spoke and went on to say, "Lee Hyung-ho is here with me now. You have 48 hours to collect a ransom of 70 million won. Wait for further contact and do not call the police." To which the shocked father replied with a numb yes. Only then would the caller hang up. In spite of the kidnapper's direct orders, Woo-shi immediately told the officer exactly what he had been told. The police officer would immediately contact his superiors for support. After learning about the situation, the authorities covertly outfitted the Lee's home with a series of recording and monitoring devices. From here, they would be waiting for the kidnapper's next call. Unfortunately, all that they could actively do was wait for the young boy's kidnapper, who they had nicknamed the Snake, to make a call. For the next 2 days, the kidnapper seemed to disappear without a trace. However, on the morning of January 31st, as the Lee family was anxiously waiting, the phone rang, and there was a man's voice on the phone, which was quickly recognized due to its serpent-like quality. The voice said, "I know you have been in contact with the police." The officers listening were quite surprised, due to them having taken every precaution possible to guarantee that the kidnapper would not have noticed them. But despite this, the man seemingly had outwitted them. Mr. Lee replied with the statement, "We are in an ordinary residence. Where did the idea of the police come from? You must have been mistaken," making it explicitly known that neither he nor his wife had made any form of contact with the authorities. The stepmother in turn spoke to affirm her husband's statement, which to this, the voice on the other end just hung up. This had led to the parents and the police to start to sink into the depths of despair. However, the authorities quickly figured out that the call was made by the kidnappers to test whether the parents had already contacted the police. In short notice, the phone rang again. The lie had paid off. The passionate affirmation had worked. The family had convinced the Snake that they had not contacted the police. He would then instruct Mr. Lee to take 70 million won to a secured parking lot of the Seoul Gimpo Airport by himself. The Lee family would immediately set forth to do as they were told. Lee Woo-shi loaded the prepared cash into the car and was ready to set off. Along with the money, the police had an officer stow away in the trunk as to catch the kidnapper unawares. As this occurred, another group of police officers would discreetly tail Lee Woo-shi's car. Once they had arrived, the Snake contacted the Lees. The kidnapper did not show up, though. Instead, Woo-shi was told that he would be driving to the Seoul City Hall. After arriving at the City Hall, the kidnapper would once more contact Lee Woo-shi to drive to a theater in Chungmuro Road. Then, according to the kidnapper's request, Lee Woo-shi went to a fried chicken shop near the bakery next to the theater, and so on and so forth, a total of 16 times, with 16 different locations. The kidnapper would tell them to go to a different location to complete their transaction. This had led not only to the Lees, but the police officers as well, feeling an ungodly amount of dread. The kidnapper seemed to be watching them. The stepmother, who was at home, received a call from the kidnapper. The call went as follows. "Didn't you say that you didn't call the police? I saw the plainclothes policeman next to your husband." The police officer, who had remained with the stepmother, immediately made a judgment call after hearing this, and informed the stepmother quickly. She replied in a panicked voice, "No, we didn't call the police." It may have been that Lee was so afraid that he called his friends he knew to follow. The kidnapper hung up the phone and would not reply for the rest of the day. The following morning, the Lee's phone began to ring. That day, the kidnappers called once more and asked Lee Woo-shi to drive to the Gimpo airport. This was once more a bust. Then the home phone would once more ring, and the kidnapper would instruct the stepmother to drive the ransom to a small newsstand at 2:30 a.m. and then move away from the vehicle. She would do this while being accompanied by a cadre of officers. The stepmother would follow the instructions to the letter, staying away from the vehicle while the exchange was supposed to take place. However, once more, to their endless ire, the snake would not show up. There was a 30-year-old man who stood at the entrance of the subway and kept looking at the car. Unfortunately, other than looking, he gave no indication that he knew what was going on. The family was forced to bear with not knowing the fate of the child until February 5th, a full week after their son had been kidnapped, for the dreaded kidnapper to once again make contact. The phone rang, and the kidnapper told them they will not be contacted by phone in the future, but instead, they would be getting in touch via text message along with handwritten notes. The first text message instructed the family to go to a secluded area in the city and pick up a note with the preceding instructions. After retrieving the note, they saw that on the piece of paper were 2 bank account numbers, which were registered at Hanli Bank, along with the instructions to transfer 20 million won to each account. On the advice of the police, only half of the money was deposited in defiance of the snake's instructions, and they attached a little note of their own, implying that the rest will be transferred with the return of their child. They believed that the fact that the snake did not reprimand them showed that the boy was still alive. It would be another week until contact would be once again made. This time, it would be towards the grandfather of the family, Lee Woo-sil, who would be asked to do something. He was to go under the pier of the Seoul Bridge on 88th Avenue at 8 o'clock in the evening. There was to be an iron box with a small note instructing them on the next step. This time, however, Lee Woo-shi responded to the text message and asked the kidnappers to let them listen to his son. As many would have expected, the kidnappers did not take to the demands positively. He would refuse to acquiesce to the request, and threatened them by saying, "Do you not value your son's life? Do you want him to die like this?" Then he proceeded to finish by saying, "This is your last chance to behave well." This seemed to successfully scare the family into obeying. They followed the original instructions and went out to find the box, going to the southern section of Yanghua Bridge and to place the money right by the bridge, and then leave the area. Due to the fear of the child being harmed, they would proceed to follow these instructions to the letter, or so they intended the kidnapper to believe. In this instance, only the top layer of money was real. The rest were fake bills used by negotiators in hostage situations. This was the bait used to catch the kidnapper, or at least in the attempt to catch him. The police would go on to prepare an ambush with a large number of cops in the indicated location, or at least near there. That night at 10:15, the vigilance of the officers would completely fall apart. The kidnapper drove to pick up the money and quickly left with the cash. The car did not even stop. From start to finish, it just rolled on by. The police officers at the area that they had gone to were not even able to get a license plate. The failure of this scale is astronomical. It's just shocking how unbelievably and shamefully they failed. To quote Detective Choi Jan-hak, the police went undercover in the wrong location, so the money was already gone by the time they got there. At 1 a.m. that day, the kidnappers called and angrily said, "The box is full of fake money. It seems you don't want to get your son back, but thank you for not calling the police. This is the last time I will contact you." Lee Hyung-ho would begin to plead for another chance, but he would not receive one. It was too late. The snake had hung up, and true to his words, no more contact would be had. In response to this, the Korean authorities moved to freeze both bank accounts that had been given access to the original 20 million won, as to keep them from withdrawing the money. However, once again, the police seem to have failed. This seems to be kind of a pattern, since they were not able to make the bank realize the seriousness of the request. It wouldn't be until February 19th that a man would go to the Upper East branch of the Korean Commercial Bank to retrieve the 20 million won. However, the bank teller had not been made privy to the seriousness of the situation and had simply told the man his account had been frozen, meaning he could not retrieve the money. The man would then promptly run away from the bank. After this incident, the bank manager would call the police and inform them of what had occurred. Since the bank had not installed proper monitoring equipment, the bank teller had been the only person to have seen the kidnapper in any form of detail, so she would be the only one to be able to give a proper description of the individual. Unfortunately, the description she would give the authorities would be too vague to be actionable. As the authorities analyzed all the information they had gathered from the bank, including some rather shoddy CCTV footage, they would gain little information whatsoever. On March 13th, 44 days after the disappearance of Lee Hyung-ho, his body would be found in a drainage channel near the tunnel in the Jasmal area of the Han River Park. The boy's eyes, nose, and mouth were all covered in duct tape, while his hands and feet had been bound with a nylon rope. The poor boy had been suffocated to death, as shown by the autopsy. The coroner stated that the killer had simply placed tape over his mouth and watched him squirm until the young boy had ran out of oxygen. It was found that the food in his stomach was the same food he had eaten at his classmate's house the day of his disappearance. With this knowledge, it was speculated that the time of death was January 30th. It's very likely that the killer had killed the boy on the first day of his kidnapping. Basically, this sick excuse of a subhuman had toyed and tortured the boy's family for 44 days, knowing that his family would never see the boy alive again. In the years that followed, numerous composite sketches of the killer would be produced and distributed along with excerpts of his voice. Around this time, the police practice was to not disclose the progress of investigations in a case of kidnapping. Once it became a murder, it no longer applied. The media would begin to report on the case, and publicity would come about due to the cruel circumstances surrounding the case being widely reported. This led to great amounts of anger amongst the South Korean citizens. Tens of thousands of people would go on to provide clues, and the police assigned around 10,000 officers to aid in the investigation. In the many months after the case was publicly reported, more than 400 suspects were detained, and 28,000 suspects or suspicious persons were investigated. However, disgustingly enough, the individual who was the prime suspect was the boy's own uncle, who was a younger brother of the boy's biological mother. It's been rumored the man wanted to get back at Lee Hyung-ho for divorcing his sister and denying her custody of the young boy. According to the voice print analysis conducted by the National Institute of Science in South Korea at the time, the uncle's voice was a 92% match to the kidnappers. Moreover, the 29-year-old uncle at the time had borrowed money everywhere because he did not have a job. Furthermore, the name attached to the bank accounts were the same names as some of the close friends of the uncle. However, the uncle had gone to Gyeongju. Due to this, the idea that there had been more than one kidnapper involved was brought back into focus. Up until then, it was believed it had been a single-person job, or at least largely believed so. Now it was believed that it was an attempt by multiple people to extract as much wealth as possible. Although the boy's uncle was in Gyeongju, it was still believed that he could have made contact through his accomplices. And as it just so happened, the uncle was unable to remember details about the trip, other than having evidence of the time of the first call, being various receipts, which were suspiciously very well preserved, leading the police to think it was perhaps a deliberately forged alibi. However, at the end of the day, all the police were left to work with was theories, without any actionable evidence. And in total, this accounted for nothing usable in any conviction. In essence, the case would never be solved, and there would be no justice, due to running up on the statute of limitations, which unfortunately ran out for this case in 2006, which meant that any actions in the case going forward would be meaningless. The boy's father, Lee Woo-shi, would go on to say in a 2011 interview, 20 years after the incident, "Rather than punishing my son's killer, I would like to ask him why he killed him." He would then go on to state there should be no restrictions on the pursuit of murderers. It wouldn't be until 2015 that South Korea passed the Statute of Limitations of Murder Revocation Law, abolishing the statute of limitations for homicides. Unfortunately, regardless of how much time is invested in this case, it remains a cold case. If you remained with me until the end, I thank you, and I do hope you stay tuned and subscribe for more content.